Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And welcome back, everybody. If you're going through some challenges or you find some struggles in life, it may be because part of you is having a challenge. Let's focus on the word part. Apparently, we have many different parts to our personality. I wonder if that also means split personality. I'm going to let him answer that and more and try and pick at the parts to figure out what's going on there. This is all part of his wheelhouse in terms of psychotherapy, specifically something called IFS, which we dug into last time we got together with Scott Moresi, who is back with us. Hey, Scott, how you doing today?
Good. How you doing, Steve?
Excellent. Excellent. So let's go back to what we talked about, or I'm sorry, I said IFS. It's Central Internal Family Systems, correct?
No, IFS is right. Internal Family Systems. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Define that. I know you did it last time, but for anybody checking us out right now, what does it mean?
Sure thing. IFS is the idea that, something that was big back in the 60s and 70s was the family systems theory, this idea that you don't just focus on the individual, you focus on the environment in which they live, in which they're raised, et cetera, right? And that gives us a better sense of them and a better ability to help them. The founder of Internal Family Systems, Dr. Dick Schwartz, he is an expert in family systems theory and in working with family systems. And back in I believe the early to mid 80s, he started having this experience as a therapist and teaching seminars and workshops, and he started experiencing a change in perspective, and he started wondering, what if these family systems outside of us exist inside of us? And so he started working with his patients in a way where he started people were volunteering. Part of me feels this way when my husband says this, and part of me feels that way when my boss glares at me, and it reminds me of my dad, and that brings out this sad, scared part, and it feels really alone and really powerless, and etc. And so he started discovering there's kind of a cornucopia of parts inside all of us, and it kind of slips past our conscious awareness a lot of the time.
So when we talk about the parts within us, and I've heard this before, so I'm glad we're talking about this because definitely want to understand it more.
Yeah,
it seems very reasonable that there's different parts of our personality that make us. Does that mean that, schizophrenia, split personalities, can that be part of what we're talking about here?
It's thought that's the case, that, that we are all multiples and the degree of co-awareness that we have with our parts exists on a spectrum. So some people have a very high level of co-awareness between self and part. If I'm angry, for instance, I know that I'm angry. I feel that part in my chest. There's kind of a heat to it. I have thoughts and feelings and body sensations that go with that anger. The anger can also be aware of me. But with people with multiple personality disorder, what's called dissociative identity disorder, they have very little co-awareness between them and their parts, and so they exist kind of as separate entities.
So it seems like the goal here is to best know your parts.
I think so. Yeah. And for them, and in getting to know our parts, the idea is they get to know us too, and they get to start to experience and intuit us, as I always say, as a viable and available resource to them. Someone that they can go to, quite literally, figuratively and literally, when they're in distress, so that they don't act out and have us pick up a cigarette or a glass of wine or go online shopping or some kind of a behavior that, we may otherwise rather not do.
So there's a lot of us that have a fear of abandonment. So why don't we focus on that section and the parts connected to it? If you've identified the parts that connect to fear of abandonment, and you're in a good place there, or maybe you've had it and you've done the work, does it mean that when you're going through that feeling of aloneness that you rely on that part. And it's almost if it's like I'm trying to describe this, but like it's a friend
Yeah.
within, and you feel connected, whereby, and that's the great scenario, whereby if you haven't figured that out, that fear of abandonment, it's like, oh, well, I'm alone. I'm alone right now. This is horrible.
Right.
Now I have anxiety. Am I describing that, in kind of,
I
best
love
to
the way
worst
you
case?
put that. Yeah, Steve, I love the way you put that. A friend within. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it in a nutshell. I think that is what. But as nice as that sounds to you and me, our parts won't hear that by itself. Meaning that people with attachment wounding who have the fears of abandonment, um, their parts, from an IFS perspective and from the way that I think about this stuff, what, like, if you think of the most secure person that person who really has a sense of themselves, and maybe they get shaken from time to time, but they have a hardy, resilient kind of a sense of themselves, and they don't seem to doubt themselves a whole lot and have a whole lot of what we're talking about, fears of abandonment, things like that. It's thought, that probably they have strong bridges between them and their parts that got formed probably at an early age
Hmm.
through secure attachment with their parents. And that's a somatic bridge of mutual awareness. They and their part know where they are, even if it's not conscious. And then the other bridge is a relational bridge of awareness. So on top of that sort of wiring or infrastructure that the somatic awareness allows, that what's a relational bridge of awareness is predicated upon a secure somatic bridge of awareness. It's hard to have one without the other. And so if you have the somatic and relational bridges well established, so there's a strong line of communication and awareness between us and our parts, then we still may be alone at times, and we might reach out to a family member or a friend, but we won't feel the crushing weight of a terror of abandonment.
How do you define the word somatic?
Great question. There's this fancy word called interoception,
That's a tough
which
one.
is the kind of internal awareness of our physical environment, of our bodies, so that if you and I were talking for a few moments and you said, hey, I'm really frustrated about something, and I said, hey, Steve, that frustration you're feeling, where are you experiencing it in your body? And you say, oh, it's just kind of like pressure in my chest, there's a little bit of heat, etc. Then that takes that interoception or somatic awareness to be able to know that.
So you said before the somatic bridge and other bridges to your parts, and we can talk about a fear of abandonment or any challenge that comes from an early connection with your parents.
Yeah.
Can that bridge be fortified later in life?
Yeah, it can. They didn't used to think that it could. They, as recently as the 90s, it was thought that trauma was kind of a permanent state and that you just sort of managed it the best you could, and now with a lot of these types of approaches like internal family systems, EMDR, somatic experiencing, those kinds of things, they give us the ability to re-fortify these bridges, maybe rebuild them from the ground up.
Wow.
But yeah, they do work over time.
So let's talk about, pick any challenge, the fear of abandonment. Somebody comes to you with that. How do you work with them using IFS?
Yeah. Okay. So I would tend to think of IFS again as internal family system. So with the emphasis on system. So that fear of abandonment would be thought of as an exile, a young, vulnerable part that's burdened by some kind of attachment wound. And the idea is that part, whether it knows it or not, is in relationship with probably two other types of parts. One, there's this manager that's going to try and protect it from feeling abandoned through jealousy and control and maybe peppering their partner or their spouse with questions of where they've been,
Sure.
who have they been talking to. You know, there's that fear of abandonment being acted out. And opposite of that is going to be some kind of a part that might do probably some kind of pleasure-seeking behavior, so, you know, some kind of addictive thing that helps to numb the pain when it gets to be too much, like drugs or sex or whatever. And so we would work with the protectors first. We'd work with the managers and the firefighters who are looking after that exile, and we'd help them feel that they don't have to work so hard, that there's somebody else there, and that's the client. Well, and me too as a therapist, but primarily the client. As we help the protectors relax and get the sense that they're not alone and that they don't have to work so hyper vigilantly, then we can turn our attention to that part that has that fear of abandonment. And the idea is that we help unburden that part, quite literally. Somatically and relationally, we help the part to give the client sort of a chance to witness its pain in the places where it's been hurt and wounded. And we do do-overs and retrievals and unburdenings and things like that that are they're a way to allow the system to heal in a way that it wasn't given the chance to, so that those bridges can kind of they're supposed to be there, they're meant to be there, and when they're not there, you know it. You can tell the person's going to be very distressed.
Do you find in working with people that some may not even know that they're have a fear of abandonment? You know, it's there, and you gave a great example before, jealousy. So you could have, you know, a partnership, marriage, whatever it might be, and you could have one person who has a fear of abandonment that doesn't know it, and they're jealous of the other person who is maybe a free will, doesn't worry about anything. You know, they don't have that fear, but this presents it as jealousy. And like you said, maybe some suspicion, you know, they don't worry about anything. What's going on over there? Because they don't quite understand they have a fear of abandonment. Is that often the case when you deal with people?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think, yeah, I mean, especially to the extent that they may have chosen a partner who's not like them, who's free-spirited, and, you know, they
probably by intention, because they see that you know, the opposites attract, the yin and the yang, you know, that right. You know, living through the other person, that quality probably excites them. Oh, that's great, you know, but in retrospect, probably not the best thing, because then there's, you know, those challenges that come up, suspicion and things like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Usually people with fear of abandonment know that they're afraid of being abandoned. They just, their protectors tend to come up with early strategies. Like we talked about last time, right? We have our sort of, you know, from a developmental perspective, we're born with an original self. And then there's some kind of original wound, which births this wounded self. And then that wounded self births a whole bunch of strategic selves, or parts, really. We're talking about parts, but unless we're talking about the original self. And when those parts come into existence, well, then, you know, that has a lot to do with sort of the early development of the way that person's personality and character start to form. And yeah.
How many parts do we have, or is it potentially endless?
That's a great question. I hear that often. You know, Dick Schwartz, I think, was recorded saying that on average we have around 50 or 60 parts, that as much as potentially that many that are active and that we can be conscious of. But I think there is kind of a semi-infinite number of parts that we could have.
Wow. I would think that some of them are the key parts, and then there's, you know, if you look at a chart, subparts within those.
Right. Right. Yeah. I oftentimes ask my clients, when they feel a little overwhelmed with their parts, take a second, imagine they're standing on a stage, and see if they can get a sense of what parts are in the foreground, the midground, and the background of that stage. And, you know, where's the spotlight? Where are the parts that are most charged up and in that light on the stage? And let's have the other parts kind of step back for a moment, maybe sit in the seats and watch, and see if we can attend to those parts that the spotlight's on.
Is it beneficial to identify your parts?
I think that it is because by identifying them, we get a sense of something that's very important in this type of work, Steve, which is a sense of distinctness, a sense of, okay, I'm over here, and this part is this tension in my chest, let's just say, or at least it's showing up there. And as we have a sense of it, it has a sense of us, and that distinctness develops where we and the part confuse ourselves less that we're the same.
It's funny when you start thinking about this, Scott, in terms of, what part of me, this is a part of me. And most of your parts in my view of this have needs. They always want something.
Yeah.
Which is challenging because in life, you've got people wanting stuff. Your kids need things. These people need things. And now your parts need things. So it's almost as if more of a reason why you need to put up boundaries because you need you. And now I'm seeing that even clearer. You've got a part here. You've identified it. Maybe it's the fear of abandonment part. Well, it needs to be pacified. So you need to give that some attention. Then you got a part over here that needs something over here. Is that a reasonable way to look at it? I don't mean it in a negative way, but there's so many different things pulling from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other piece that we haven't talked about is the idea of something that might sound a little strange to throw into the mix here, but it's called
at this point, I don't think anything's going to sound strange.
There's this idea of self-like parts. And these are parts that really think they're us, and we really think they're them. For instance, you or I might have like a really good creative productivity part that can just churn out work and just crank it out, and there's a lot of identification with that part, and we kind of think we're that part, and the part kind of thinks it's us. That could be something said potentially to be like a self-like part, and it's one that oftentimes masquerades as us, that a lot of people would think as our public persona, for instance, or the personas are the ones that kind of mask as us, and we oftentimes mask as them, which is good and bad. But again, that comes back to the question of distinctness. How much are we aware when that part is up and that it's not us and that we're a resource for it?
This gets very complicated because now when you think about it, you might be a different person at work, different persona. And you might be calling upon different parts when you're at work, but when you go home, you're a different person at home. So there's different parts that get played.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Wow. But lots going on here, but a better understanding, once you start figuring out what is really taking place within our personalities, it runs way deep. And even to the point, and I'm kind of shocked when you said back in the 90s, when it comes to the traumas that we've endured, mostly as children. And for anybody that hasn't heard previous talks, we're not talking necessarily about major traumas. It could be something little. You heard something as a kid, and now that pilots you nowadays. When you think of everything that, like in the 90s, that the traumas can't be corrected, we just live with them. Kind of shocked to hear that, because nowadays with so many different modalities, even hypnotherapy, there's a lot of different ways to attack those traumas and work through them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such great news for everybody, and whether someone chooses to do IFS or EMDR or somatic experiencing, it's a matter of fit. But I'll say one thing, Steve, is that one of the reasons why I'm so dedicated to IFS, internal family systems, is because when you go to an EMDR therapist, it's really hard to learn to do EMDR on yourself. You'd have to take a lot of courses, and with IFS, it's not the case. With IFS, for instance, I'll tell you something. Let's pretend for a moment that, you have this part that's often up. Maybe it's an anxious part, and maybe it's in your throat. And in the process of IFS therapy, you would develop the relationships and the distinctness and all that kind of stuff. But, one of the most important things that any of us can do to continue to grow that infrastructure, that mutual infrastructure of awareness between us and our parts, is simply to notice, okay, where is that part? Oh, okay, that's in my throat. What are the different sensations that go with that part? There's kind of like a tightness, a constriction. There's kind of a cold, dry kind of, it's not comfortable, And then where are you showing up? Meaning when you try to connect with what we call self or self-presence, where do you feel at ease? Where do you feel what we call non-part energy that's showing up in your body? And let's say you did a gentle body scan for a moment, Steve, and let's say that was in your belly. Let's say there was a warm calmness in your belly, a kind of confidence. And I'd kind of immerse your awareness into that confidence, into that warmth in your belly, that self-presence. And then I'd invite you to share it, to extend it to this anxiety in your throat. As strange as that may sound to you in the part, just try it and see what happens. And notice what happens. And oftentimes that anxiety will kind of calm a little bit. Not always, but often it'll chill a little bit, kind of step back, take notice of you and go, you did that. And then something starts to change. It starts to intuit us more again as that viable, available resource that it's looking for.
Wow. That was actually super cool. It's almost as taking the good part and transferring it to, let's say, the bad part. And what you just said, as I was internalizing it, hearing it, trying to feel it, it almost seemed like a little bit of hypnotherapy.
So in some ways, there's some similarities to it.
Yeah. Just the way you were describing it, just had that feeling of, just convincing somebody to move it forward. But great description. Fantastic talking with you today, Scott. Really learned a lot.
You as well, Steve.
And it definitely backed up, this whole thing that we have different parts to us. Get used to it. It truly is reality. If somebody wants to dig in deeper, maybe some questions, maybe how the IFS whole thing works, how do they find you?
Find me at beyondwordspsychotherapy.com or 510-735-8868. I'd be happy to talk with you.
Sometimes things are beyond words. Because, and you know what it is? It's feelings. It's feelings. Yeah. And that comes from the parts. Scott, great having you on today. Looking forward next time we talk.
Me too.
Appreciate it. We'll be right back.
Sounds good.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes you just gotta hold on and know we'll get through this. Mom, we are so high up. Hold my hand.
No, you hold my hand.
Here we go.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org to find out more.
I learned patience from my adoptive dad. All he had to say was,
"Hey, you got this. Just breathe." Hey, we're pretty good.
Yeah.
Might have to start a band.
I got it.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org to find out more. This message is brought to you by Adopt US Kids, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the Ad Council.